I don't know about you, but personally, I find Zoomers actually quite fascinating. And there are a number of reasons for this. You see, in contrast to basically every other human generation that's ever existed, Zoomers have undergone a rapid transformation due almost solely to the environment, i.e. tech, that no one has ever experienced before. Now, before we proceed, I just want you to imagine how static, boring, repetitive previous generations were. Even ours, those of us who are older than Zoomers, to varying degrees. Not quite as extreme as generations even earlier than that, but think about, say, a medieval blacksmith and his son and his son. And the tradition basically goes on for 200, 300 years. It doesn't change a whole lot. If you go from the year 1000 to 1300, it's pretty static. And so the technology did change to some degree, but it wasn't life-altering. Now, in this video, I'm going to make the argument that essentially, after birth control, the internet has been the greatest game changer, the biggest life-altering technological/environmental intervention that has ever existed. And the reason why the Zoomers are interesting in this respect is because they're at the forefront. Unlike basically anyone else, they have grown up exclusively with the internet, exclusively with this technology, 24/7. Now, it's true that many parents have exercised caution and have not always offered their Zoomer children direct access immediately, say when they were 3 or 4 years old, but these specimens exist as well. Those among them who have had access to this technology from the youngest age possible. And you really cannot underestimate what a profound effect this has had on Zoomers as a generation of human beings. Now think about it, evolutionary change is relatively slow, not as slow as people propose, as in it doesn't take millions of years, but you at least need a couple of generations for real change. And so fundamentally Zoomers are not that different from Generation X, Millennials, and even Boomers, not in their physiology as human beings. But when you factor in the technological effects, then in many ways, they might as well be a slightly different species. And so the Zoomer is basically terminally online to varying degrees, because depending on the person and who you ask, the definition of terminally online can vary quite a bit. But bear in mind that the internet is probably the second most disruptive form of technology ever invented after birth control for our species. And Zoomers are at the forefront of this. And so that's the background to this, so to speak. The Zoomers are mysterious. And I think, and this is the main topic of the video I want to address, there's a lot of misunderstanding as to what Zoomers are like and want going forward, because they will be taking the reins of power. They are already graduating, and they are going to shape the world. And so one of the most persistent things you'll see online, and I think it has a lot to do with the circles people hang out in, or the bubbles, as it were, is this notion of the base Zoomer, right? That in fact, Zoomers are fairly conservative, that's the claim at least, that they want to return to tradition and want things to be more like the olden days. And that we're going to see going forward over the next 10 or 15 years a radical shift in how Zoomers shape the world and their life outcomes, and it's going to resemble something of the days of old, the days of yore. This is a persistent meme you'll see online. Base conservative Zoomers who just have more old-fashioned values because they're so fed up with modernity and fed up with the internet and so on and so forth. Now, on the face of it, that sounds quite nice, without a doubt. But unfortunately, that's pretty far from the truth. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But where does this myth or this illusion come from of the base Zoomer? Well, the base Zoomer kind of is a thing. It's just that the base Zoomer makes up an absolutely tiny fraction of the total Zoomer population. The base Zoomer who has conservative values, who wants to settle down, get married, have children, fiscally conservative, that is a very small percentage. And if you run in certain circles online, then of course you're more likely to encounter that as a phenotype. But when you actually look into things, and I've taken the time to do this on more than one occasion, in terms of surveys, polls, and of course that's not perfect, but it's still a better proxy than observing a couple of Zoomers online, an N of 10 or whatever, and saying, well, this is the way Zoomers are. So in this case, we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of Zoomers who've been subjected to surveys, polls, questionnaires, and just general questions about the way they view life. The overwhelming majority of Zoomers are not quote-unquote based, but rather quite left-leaning, as in not even liberal, but very progressive. For example, when it comes to universities in the United States, and they're an absolutely lost cause, I want to cover this subject in a separate video because it really, really is bad. You have no idea. But when it comes to universities, and they've done surveys, polling, the last Zoomers questions revolving around free speech and whether or not professors should be able to teach subjects that make Zoomers feel uncomfortable or Zoomers disagree with, whether professors should be able to say things that potentially might be offensive. And yes, there are some base Zoomers, but the majority of the Zoomers, in this respect, support censorship, support in some cases cancellation and the firing of such professors across multiple universities, according to polls and surveys. And whilst it's true that the Zoomers did not start modern-day progressivism, they are the recipients of it, and they are almost certainly the most vocal proponents and exponents of modern-day progressivism. They're the ones, more so than millennials, certainly more so than Generation X, who push for it more than any other generation. And whilst it's true that the seeds have been planted in the Zoomers, the not-based Zoomers, if you will, previous generations, Boomers certainly, and then to some degree Generation X, although Generation X, my generation, is a bit of a forgotten generation. We're sort of just floating in the ether and nobody really thinks about us. And in any event, the Zoomers just lump us in with Boomers, for that matter. So it's not that consequential. But yes, the seeds were planted in the Zoomers. And if you wanted to blame somebody, I'm sure you could pin the blame on the Boomers and to a lesser extent Generation X. But regardless of the ideology, as it were, of modern-day progressivism, it doesn't really make a difference because Zoomers, in their current incarnation, are the most enthusiastic proponents of modern progressive ideas. Now, millennials aren't too far off, to be honest, especially the younger ones. But most Zoomers are not based. Most Zoomers are not returning to traditional values. And case in point, everyone thought as the older Zoomers settle down and think about things, they're going to have children earlier, they're going to get married, they're going to go through the rigmarole of traditional expectations and what have you. But no, one thing that's been observed by psychologists is this notion of delayed adulthood. This idea that rather between the ages of 18 and 25, you come into your own and you sort of become an adult. The age keeps on getting pushed up further and further. So in the case of Zoomers, although they're not yet 30, it probably will take until 30 for many of them to come into their own, to get into the world and figure it out for themselves. And on top of that, we've never had a more neurotic, nervous, and worried generation. The typical Zoomer is a highly neurotic, fearful individual, is frankly speaking scared of the world to a degree that is scarcely imaginable. Now, we all suffer from fear, and neuroticism varies between individuals, but they have evolved in an ecosystem that is so vastly different from the previous ones that, as I said, they might as well be a different species in some respects. So again, from the university, many Zoomers, probably most, are afraid to think for themselves to any degree that we can even think for ourselves. They're much less inclined to challenge certain orthodoxies as opposed to others. Think about terms such as microaggressions. Although the millennials came up with it, it's the Zoomers who breathe it in and out and live it on their daily basis. So more neurotic, more fearful, much more interested in policing speech in general, not particularly conservative, ultra-progressive in most cases, with extreme instances, of course, related to the higher neuroticism and what have you of delayed adulthood. And add to that the addiction to the internet in the case of female Zoomers, social media, in the case of male Zoomers, prawn addiction, and you really have a recipe for disaster. It's very unlikely that the majority of Zoomers are going to be settled in with kids and families and normal values, as we used to view them at least, anytime soon. And you have to think about this. Of course people change, and of course people's views of the world change. But when you spent the entirety of your life subjected to a particular ideology, that's not going to change that much. Yes, some people will grow out of it. Some people can be reasoned out of it, talked out of it, but the majority of them won't. And so, if you think things are bad now, consider what it's going to look like in the future when Zoomers do enter into the real world, when they hit their 30s and they become full adults, as it were, changing, mingling, and indeed influencing the world. This is not the Zoomers' fault. Again, the seeds had been planted in them by earlier generations, but they are the recipients. They are the trees, the flowers, and the plants spreading the gospel, as it were. And unfortunately, as we've come to know, the gospel they are spreading is not very pleasant. Again, not an attack on Zoomers as human beings, but rather as a generation that has unfortunately been subjected to rather toxic notions and ideologies and has imbibed far too many of the fumes of said ideologies and notions. It will be very interesting going forward to observe what becomes of them, if I'm still around, of course, but we'll see. In any event, as always, thank you for tuning in. Many special thanks to my patrons and donors on PayPal. You guys are the lifeblood of the channel. You keep it going. Without you, all would be naught but dust and ash. As for everybody else, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. Be much appreciated. Supposedly it helps out with the algorithm. In any event, it'd be much appreciated. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out next time. Until then, may the gods truly watch over you. Bye-bye for now. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.